Eric, thank you for joining me here today. What I do for every guest, I go through a bunch of podcasts they've been on, a bunch of their material, your own podcast, of course, and I find myself more excited for this conversation than normal. And I think that's because I feel a deep sense of connection to your journey, what you've been on, and your mission, and just how you come across, like just a real authentic seeker of the world, trying to explore more and learn more. And so that made me really excited to talk to you today. So thank you for being here.
Thank you, Danny. That's a gracious welcome.
Well, I'd love to start with how you typically end your meetings with a spiritual advisor of yours, which is on the topic of trust. Why is that a topic that you and your spiritual advisor come back to and end conversations with often?
It's a good question. I assume because it's where I have work to do. I mean, I would assume it's not intentional. It's certainly not like we decide we're going to talk about trust. It just seems like every conversation we get into, I think we're talking about X and we wander our way around. And the next thing I know, we're back to trust. I'm like, here we go again. So I assume it's because it's something that I need to work on. And I think it comes down to, I think it comes down to what can we trust in when we're at the end of our own limits or ability. So I have a pretty high level of confidence in my abilities. I mean, and I don't mean that arrogantly. I just have been around for 50 years and have done a bunch of things, and I just feel fairly confident. Like, okay, I can handle the things that life brings my way. And yet we all get up against a limit. We all get up at a point where it's like, well, I'm at the end of my rope, whatever that means. So what can I trust in? Where can I turn? And I think that's what it comes down to. And I think as I go deeper into questions about meaning and life and all that, that's where I seem to end up.
On that topic, why do you think you've been attracted to questions around meaning and life in general?
Some of it, I think, comes naturally. It just seems to be my temperament to ask those kind of things. I think some of it is a relatively early on seen through sort of the facade of the world. I don't know how else to say it, sort of seeing that everything that we tended to pursue and that we chased after didn't seem important, or didn't seem like it led to meaningful happiness. And then my descent into addiction led me into recovery at 24 in a 12-step program. And 12-step programs are, they describe themselves as being spiritual programs, right? They're about, and now that could mean lots of different things, but that's ultimately what spirituality means to me. It's a question about what matters, like what's really important. So I think a combination of a natural interest in those things, a natural turning towards the deeper side. I don't know, I can't say why. And then I think being forced into it by necessity.
And so one of the things that I discovered when looking at your story was that when you went into that place of recovery from addictions, you became disillusioned with the idea of God, of the normal God, the way it was described. And I was so curious to ask, why? Why were you disillusioned?
Yeah, so what you're referring to is I got sober at 24. I was a homeless heroin addict. I basically burnt my life down. And I got sober in 12-step programs in Central Ohio in 1994. And so, in 12-step programs, the third step, there's a line, we turned our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood him. Right. And so that line, as we understood him, is really important, although there's still the him in it, which sort of points you towards like, okay, it's a guy up in the sky. But in Ohio in those days, that's what people were talking about. And I just went, I'll accept whatever they have because I'll do anything. I've got to get sober or I'm going to die or I'm going to go to jail for a long time. So I did it and it worked and I got sober. But it was sort of like I was believing by kind of gritting my teeth. And it's ultimately because when I look at the evidence of the world, I can't make a coherent answer out of there being a God up there, out there somewhere that's arranging human affairs in such a way, and that I could actually ask that God to help me. Because I just saw things that I couldn't square. So I would be like, well, you know, in AA, people would say all the time, well, I'm sober by the grace of God. I go, okay, that's interesting. But Bob died last week. So did God not like Bob? God likes me, but not Bob? And so those sort of questions, I could never square them. And so every answer that I would hear as a response to that, I would go, that doesn't, it doesn't work for me. Now, I don't know the answer. I mean, I have no idea. It's a great mystery. I don't know how any of this works, right? But we can only go with what feels real to us. And the idea of an interventionist God in that way raised too many questions that I just couldn't square enough to really get 100% behind. I couldn't trust in it. Let's put it that way. I mean, back to that idea of trust. I was like, I don't know how do I trust this? What am I trusting? I don't, so I think that's where it kind of broke down for me. And so what happened was I stayed sober off that sort of what I'll call sort of forced belief. And I don't mean anybody forced me. I forced me to believe a certain way. But when things in my life happened and my life sort of fell apart in a couple of ways, then I really needed a deeper source of support. And when I turned towards my understanding of spirituality, I went, oh, it's not really built on a firm foundation, for me.
Yeah. When did you start to explore deeper the question of God and the question of your own spirituality?
I think I probably did it in earnest, when I got sober at 24. Although I had been into Zen Buddhism a little bit in high school. I'd had a teacher who'd given me some books, and I was sort of intrigued, but I don't think I even really understood what I was reading. And but I had there was a book called the Tao Te Ching that I had absolutely loved. I read it, late teens all the way through. So I always had some sort of interest. I dated a girl in high school who was very religious. Like the kind of Christian that you look at and you're like, okay, if that's what it means to be Christian, I think I might want to sign up with you, right? Like that really beautiful, like just love flowing through and out of them kind of person. So I think I was also a lot having to ask the question of, do I believe in God during those times? Because I loved her. And ultimately we hit a point where I was like, I love you, but you think I'm going to hell. This is problematic, right? Like this is, we're both in an uncomfortable situation here, right? Like I think you love me, and I think you think I'm a good person, but according to your theological beliefs, and based on what I believe, I'm destined for hell. And I think that's kind of hard to build a relationship around.
What made her specifically full of love and made you want to almost sign up for Christianity? What about her in particular?
I think she had just a warm, positive energy. Now, again, how much of that is natural to her and how much of that came from her faith, you never know, right?
Yeah.
But, and she just, she was full of love. Like, she was full of love for other people. Like, she just genuinely really cared about people and was really just devoted herself to helping other people and serving other people. And so, from her lens, that was because of her, her love for God and from God's grace. That was her perspective on why she was that way.
You've said before that self-love is the prevention and treatment for depression. And when I heard you say that, I was like, whoa, I've never really thought about it like that before. Self-love is the prevention and treatment for depression. What made you say that?
Well, I don't remember saying it. So, but it's not, I mean, I'm not surprised I said it. It aligns with what I believe, but you'll find this, you're a few episodes, a good number of episodes in, but after a certain while and you get interviewed 50, 60, 70 times, you'll be like, well, I've said nearly all kinds of crazy stuff. However, why do I think that self-love is important in dealing with depression? I mean, the biggest thing is that we spend more time with ourselves locked in our own brain than we do anyone else. Even often when we're with other people, particularly if we're depressed, we're still locked in our own brain, And so having that be a hospitable place to live is pretty important. I think the other reason is that, a lack of self-love or self-loathing has a tendency to drive us further into shame and further into despair, and none of those ways of interacting with the world allow us to do what we most need to do to heal anything, I think, which is to learn. So if I am just like, let's say I make a mistake and I'm just all wrapped up in, I'm such a I'm a loser, I'm awful, whatever your brand of self-loathing is. If that's what's happening, what is not happening is, I wonder why I did that. Oh, what was going on in that situation that made it so that, like, sometimes I'm able to act one way, but what was it about this situation that caused me to act in that way I don't feel good about? What could I have done differently? So that's what we need to learn, learning. And when we are not in self-compassion, self-love, we're not in a learning mode. Self-compassion, self-love frees us up enough and opens us up enough, I think, that we're able to actually learn, which is how we change.
What are other practices we can do to increase self-love? One thing that I like to do is I write, I love myself 100 times every day. And since doing that, I feel more joy and openness come into my life. And I'm like, why is that happening exactly? I really try to figure out what's going on there. But I'm curious for you, what are ways we can practice more self-love?
This is a trickier thing to do in, how do I actually do it? So, I think there's a variety of different approaches and techniques. So I got sober at 24, and it was a pretty life-changing experience for me in many ways. And I did it in a 12-step program. And there are some ways in 12-step programs, the actual 12 steps, that's why they're called that. They're these things that you do. And there were a couple in there that were really important. One was you sort of do this searching, they call it a searching and fearless moral inventory. Those are very heavily weighted terms. We might just say, I look at all the ways that I have, harmed other people. I look at the patterns that get in my way. I look at my fears. I look at who I'm angry with. I just really get an understanding of what's going on in this interior landscape. And then we turn around and we do something called a fifth step. And the fifth step is you share that with someone else. And that's a really beautiful moment for a lot of people, because you go in there with this like, oh my God, I can't believe I'm going to tell somebody all these awful things. And you tell them and they're just like, yeah, me too. And then I had lots of people over the years tell me their fourth, do their fifth step with me. And the same thing. I just keep hearing this over and over. I'll be like, oh yeah, you too, me too. So you do that a little while. And for me, that had a healing effect. There was a healing effect about being able to talk about the things inside me that felt ugly or dirty or bad, and hear other people reflect them back and go, oh, okay, I'm not that different. Then we go on and we have a couple steps called, they're called the amends steps. I make a list of people I've harmed, and I go out and I try and make things right with them. So I go out and I sort of clean up where it's reasonable or doable. I clean up some of the messes I've made in my life, and I get back to sort of, a clean slate, and that helps with self-love, I think. So I think some of it is some of it's an inside job, some of it's an outside job. One way to feel better about ourselves, broadly speaking, is to live in a way that we feel good about. So it's hard to cultivate a lot of self-love if you continue to live in, ways that you really feel bad about, right? And so now this is you get a bit of a chicken and egg with all this stuff, right? Like some self-love helps you to actually stop doing some of these behaviors. Years of therapy, I've done a lot of meditation, and some of the meditation has been what we call meta meditation, which is, loving kindness, and you direct some of that loving kindness towards yourself. So I think there's a variety of different ways to try and cultivate this. But I would say, broadly speaking, the one that has felt most important to me is really recognizing that, like, my insides are very similar to lots and lots of other people's insides. I'm not uniquely broken or bad or weird or any of that stuff.
Why do you think we get into that thought pattern? It's so common, and I've experienced that thought pattern as well, of like, I shouldn't be this way. I'm this way, and I really dislike myself for being this way. Why does that thought pattern even occur?
I think because we are wired up as humans to present the best parts of ourselves to the outside world. So for most of us, we've never had anybody model saying, like, I really feel, I'm this way or I'm that way, or really talk about what's going on inside. So there's a lot of just putting on a brave face for the world that goes on. And so, and we also, I also think we don't see people that we would look at and go, oh, there's a successful person, and realize, like, oh yeah, they've got those same things going on. I think that's probably the biggest reason. I think it's the biggest reason. And I think when we live out of alignment with our values, or if we want to say that in a way that sounds differently, when we live out of alignment with what's important to us, that just really feels bad. And so if we're doing that, we are going to have some of this stuff going on internally that doesn't feel right.
Do you think that issue has gotten worse as social media has risen up and people are presenting a version of themselves that's maybe the best version of themselves, but it might be different than the actual version? Do you think social media has played any role in increasing the divide between what we present and what we are feeling, thus making us feel more upset?
Probably. But it certainly is, it is not a new phenomenon, right? People have been comparing themselves unfavorably to other people for as long as we've been people. I mean, way before social media, we had a phrase in AA, we used to say, don't compare your insides to someone else's outsides. So we were talking about that very same phenomenon, right? Like, I feel like yuck inside, but I'm comparing myself to your completely put together outside. And so I do think social media has the capacity to make it worse, for sure. I think it just gives us more and more and more opportunities for comparison. But magazines and TV, certainly, you had it then too, right? I could have it growing up. I could turn on the TV and see, the perfectly built, male model and be like, well, I don't look like that, and so there it starts, right? But yeah, I think it's exacerbated it.
Yeah, that makes sense. I want to talk about your maybe high school years where you founded a nonprofit for disadvantaged children. What exactly was going through your mind when you were doing that?
So it started with, for whatever reason, I went to a soup kitchen. I have no idea how I ended up volunteering in a soup kitchen. I don't know how it happened, but I did. There I was. And I saw these kids. And I don't know if it was through a conversation with them or what it was, but I got the sense, I was like, I just got the sense that many of them, I don't think had ever left the neighborhood they were in. Mm. Like, I realized, like, these kids, I don't even think these kids have seen the zoo, right? I grew up in, a relatively privileged suburban life. Like, going to the zoo, you just went, it was like, of course you would go to the zoo. Your parents take you to the zoo. But I realized these kids didn't have some of those very basic experiences. So how are they going to imagine their way out of the life they were in if they hadn't seen it? And again, now we have more social media and internet, and you can see lots of different things. But this is, late 80s, right? So, I mean, yeah, they could see TV, but that was it. Otherwise, you don't see anything except your neighborhood. And so it started by, I just simply wanted to take a bunch of kids to the zoo. But I quickly realized, a teacher used to tell the story and joke that I would be, I was calling these places up and be like, where can I get my hands on some kids to take them to the zoo? And people were like, there's no way, so obviously nobody was going to turn their kids over to a bunch of people they didn't know to take them to the zoo. So we scrapped that and we thought, well, what if we just went down to this community organization? There was a church that had a community organization. And what if we just tutored some of these kids? What if we just went, okay, we're high school kids getting a relatively good education at a decent high school. What if we just went and took early elementary school kids who were, getting probably very bad educations, and just try to tutor them and give them a little love. And so we did it. We just started it with a couple of us and we went, wow, this really seems to work. Like, it's really helping it's really helping the kids there. And equally, it's really good for us. Like, and so from there, I think then, whatever the entrepreneurial part of me came alive and went, well, if it's good at 2, it'd be better at 8 and, 16, and let's start a scholarship. And so, the whole thing kind of just, got going. But I learned a really important lesson there that I realized again later, which is that I do best when I'm engaged in things that are trying to help other people and I'm a little less focused on me. Yeah. Like, I just work well. I think most humans do. But it's a particularly useful mode for me to work in. Yeah,
I was thinking it's very difficult for me to imagine that this person who just wants to help kids in disadvantaged communities experience more to life and bring them an imagination is going to turn into a heroin addict at 23 or 24. Like, those two people seem so far removed. And so could you bridge the gap between how somebody with such a service-oriented mind becomes somebody addicted to a substance that could end up putting them on the brink of death?
Yeah, well, I think the connection is there. I can see the connection, and the connection is that service work I was doing, again, really helped me. And what I mean by that is it was a way of dealing with underlying depression and other issues. I was a troubled kid. I mean, I was in trouble all the time. And high school was no different, right? And I was about to be expelled from high school, and I got sent last chance to this alternative program. And that's where all this happened. So, but in that time, I saw what alcohol and drugs did to those kids, and I was like, I'm not doing it. I'm not touching it, right? I could just see what it was doing to their lives. And so I became kind of straight edge and did that until I went away after I graduated from high school. I went away for a summer, and I came back, and my girlfriend was dating my best friend, and I just kind of fell apart. And one night somebody said to me, here, why don't you have a drink? And I just was in the I don't care mindset, right? Like, F it, right? And so I took the drink, and it was all of a sudden like, oh, I feel 100% better. And I mean, I was rarely sober from that moment till 24. I was just kind of, so it was off to the races for me. So I actually remember being pretty early into my drinking and going and being in the car very near where we used to tutor those kids and drinking in the car. And it still kind of chokes me up to this day, and realizing that, like, I was giving that, I mean, I gave that up. I walked away from it to pursue, drinking. And so, I had a lot of underlying wounds that the tutoring program that I was doing temporarily helped me see, like, here's actually how you fix this, right? And then I was presented another what felt like a cure for it, and that's the one I went with for a while.
Fascinating. One of the things you often wonder about is, why did it work for you, where there were people in the same situation who went through AA and it didn't work for them? And you described it as a mystery, and like one of the mysteries that you really try to solve. Do you have any insight here sitting today of why it actually worked, and why some treatments actually work for people when the other people will do the same exact thing and it won't work for them?
I know some things that make a difference, but there are still deep mysteries. One I think has to do with the level of support people have. It was obvious to me, even going through treatment, that, I went to this halfway house. It was kind of a 6-month halfway house for kind of people who were like considered, really, difficult cases, right? They only send you to 6-month halfway house if they're like, this guy doesn't have much chance. But a lot of the people in that program, I could look at and I could see the advantages I had from my upbringing, and from, we talk about white privilege sometimes lately, right? Well, I lived it, right? I mean, I probably, had I not been a white kid from the suburbs, probably would have gone to jail for a long time instead of potentially going to jail and being given an opportunity. I was given an opportunity to divert that. So I went to court, I pled guilty, and they said, if you meet all these criteria, we will wipe this away for you. Now I had to meet all the criteria, and if I didn't, I was sentenced and was gonna, so it wasn't like a free pass, but it was something that I think a lot of people would not have been given, and so even while I was in treatment, in the halfway house, I could look and be like, I'm going to leave here, and now that I'm sober, my family will take me back. And so I will go stay in a house where there's not drug addicts, right? And given that I'm a white, a good high school education, I'll be able to go find a job. So I think underlying social support is important. That said, I know people who had those same social supports that I had, and they didn't get sober. And those are the ones that I just don't understand. I don't know why. Did they have more trauma in their past? Potentially, were they more damaged than I was? I really just don't know. It really is a mystery. And if you could answer the mystery, you would, I think you'd be a billionaire. If you could solve the problem, if you could actually reliably solve the problem of addiction, you would be as rich as Elon Musk, probably.
What could we do to better understand it? Is it like go to every person who had a similar situation and interview them and like ask them questions? Like, what could we actually do to help those people, or like understand better those people so that we can better tackle it in the future?
That's a really great question that nobody has ever asked me, and I honestly don't know that I have thought about, but that is a deeply insightful question. Off the top of my head, the place we would start is we would stop spending countless billions of dollars trying to stop drugs from coming into the country, which is a futile enterprise. It just doesn't work. It has never worked. And we would take that money and maybe do what you're saying, which is turn it towards treatment, turn it towards research, turn it towards, learning about what are some of the underlying mechanisms. I think addiction is extraordinarily complex, because there are so many things that go into it. You've got who knows how many genetic factors. You've got lots of environmental factors about, how you were raised, your childhood. We do know that difficult childhoods lead at a much higher rate to addiction. It's just, the data is unambiguously clear. So, but what we don't fully know is, well, not everybody who has very difficult and traumatic childhoods goes on to become an addict, so it's not like everybody does. And so why do some do and some don't? And why do some people who appear to have, much, less difficult childhoods go on to have addiction? I mean, I have things in my childhood that were difficult, right? But if, there's something called the adverse childhood experience test. You could take it, right? And I had a guy on my show the other day, trauma survivor. I mean, he scored like a 10 out of 10. And if you could go to 20, he would have gotten a 20 out of 20. Like, wow. It's the sort of stories that would make any of us just cringe. Like, how does somebody live through that, right? Like, I got nothing to that extent. Now, I'm not minimizing the fact that what happened to me and the way I was raised didn't work for me. Obviously it had an impact, but I might be like a 4 on that scale. So, right. So I think there's those factors. There's the social factors. So there's so many factors. I don't know if we ever fully puzzle it out. I don't know. I'd say, it's like cancer. We're trying to figure it out, and we're like, we know some of the things that cause it some of the time. Like, yeah, smoking's a bad idea. You smoke, you've got a higher likelihood of getting cancer, right?
Yeah.
But we know lots of people who smoke who don't get cancer. We know lots of people who get cancer who don't smoke. And so, I think addiction is similar, So when you get into something that has so many variables in it, it's a harder thing to solve. But back to your original very good question, I mean, I would love to see us spend the money that we're spending on treating addiction and researching it versus trying to prevent it, which broadly speaking, doesn't work by trying to prevent drugs coming in, because people who want to get high will find a way to get high.
Yeah, well, I totally agree with you on the macro sense, but I'm curious in the micro sense. You're a behavior coach and you work with people one-on-one. What separates the people who get the desired result from working with you versus the ones who don't?
That I can, I can answer on one level, and then you go one level deeper and you're like, well, okay, well, why that? And I'll go, I don't know. So What I do know is that people who, I work with people longer term. So I, broadly speaking, don't work with people for like 3 sessions or 4 sessions, right? I try and, I'm more like a 15 session kind of guy, because change just takes time. That's not hard and fast rule. There are people I work with for shorter engagements, but if you're trying to make a big change, it takes time. And so what I will say is that the people who keep showing up to sessions and keep emailing me, even when they're failing, have a pretty good chance of figuring it out. However, what most people do is they get discouraged and they get embarrassed. And so they hide. It's natural, right? It's like, when you've done your homework, you sit in the front row and you're like, hey, teach, what's up, right? And when you haven't done your homework, you're slouched and hidden in the back row, right? So what happens even with somebody when they hire me to be a coach, and as many times as I say, in as many ways as I can say it, I am on your team 100%. When you're doing good, when you're doing bad, doesn't matter. Always on your team. Those people will still have that desire to, the shame will cause them to hide. And back to my point earlier about learning, right? If we're trying to change a behavior and we're not being successful at it, we have to be learning. And if you're hiding in shame and you're not showing up to sessions and you're not emailing and you're not doing the things to investigate, then we're not learning, you know? Whereas if you where people keep showing up, we just keep going, well, why? What is it? Okay, that didn't work. Let's try this. Oh, that didn't work. Let's try this. And usually if somebody does that, we can find our way through. Now, there are some people that, and I try to screen this out before I work with somebody. I would say there are people who the level of help they need is way beyond like a personal transformation coach, right? Like they're damaged well beyond that. And I'm not the right fit for them. Sometimes I might end up with someone like that who I think I can help. And then I get a little bit into it and I'm like, eesh, you know, maybe so there's some of that, but assuming I screened them correctly, which I'm generally pretty good at, and assuming they keep showing up, we're pretty good at achieving results.
Yeah. What you were just talking about reminded me of Sarah Blakely's father. So you were talking about how when we fail or we don't do our homework, we get upset and we don't want to show up again. But Sarah Blakely's father made her every day at the dinner table talk about a failure that she had been through that day. And when that occurred, it made failing cool and failing something that you actually want to do. And if you can get in love or at least become one with the failure and be happier with it and be proud of it, then you can better show up and better stay consistent.
Yeah, that's a great practice. And yeah, it really is. It is a recognition like, okay, failing happens. It's natural. It's normal. It occurs and it's an opportunity to learn, you know, so when we can reframe it that way, we're able to show up with less change. But boy, most of us particularly, a lot of times by the time somebody's going to hire a behavior coach, they've failed at the thing they're trying to change so many times.
Yeah.
I'm going to work out. I'm going to really work out. And I've said that now 50 times. I don't believe myself. I don't trust myself. And my level of shame around not doing it is really high.
So how do you get someone, sorry to cut you off, how do you get somebody who's in that place of, I've tried this 50 times and now hiring you? What do you do differently to get them to change?
Well, I mean, what we do differently to get them to change is we look at how do people change? Why do people change? What goes wrong when we change, right? There are things we know about behavior change that have been studied that we know work more often. Again, nothing works 100%, but they work more often. And so we constantly reorient towards learning, growth, and not personal failing. So one simple way to say it would be we're just constantly orienting towards that idea of a growth mindset versus a fixed mindset, right? A growth mindset says I can change, I can grow, I can be different. A fixed mindset says I'm the way I am and I'll always be that way. And when I feel that way, then I'm ashamed. So we're constantly reorienting towards, okay, yes, you've been that way. Yes, that's how you've behaved. But that's not who you are, and you can change. You have the ability to change, and we have to keep redirecting. Now, some people, for whatever reason, are able to hear and embrace that message, and they keep showing up, and they keep coming, you know, and others don't. It's, you know, in AA, one of the things we used to say all the time, and I didn't realize how profound it was till later, but we used to say this every meeting: keep coming back, you know, keep coming back. And now Now, for me, you know, we meant keep coming back to AA, and I would say, well, you know, don't keep coming back to the same thing over and over and over and over again if it's not working for you. So maybe AA isn't the thing, but keep trying.
Yeah.
You know, if you've got depression and it's still, you haven't made you're not getting anywhere with it, keep trying. Try the next medicine that your doctor recommends. Try keep trying. Because I do think we're capable of change, sometimes tremendous change, sometimes less so. And I don't fully know why some people can change much more than others, but I think most of us can make some changes for the better.
Mm. Well, one thing that's really helped me with what you're talking about, the separation of believing that you are the situation that occurred versus seeing it go through is the practice you talk about a lot, which is meditation, where when after I started doing it, I started to realize that the thoughts were coming and going and that they didn't actually represent me in any given moment. And that was a profound insight, because now all of a sudden I can have a thought that I don't like, but I don't have to attach myself to it. And so I guess talk a little bit about that. Like, do you find that clients who practice meditation on a regular basis are better suited to changing and better suited to having a growth mindset, or do you think it's irrelevant?
I don't think it's irrelevant. I think it's a very useful practice. That said, I don't think it's necessarily a useful practice for everyone all the time. You had an insight from it that I think is a liberating insight, which is we can look at it and go, "Oh, look, these thoughts keep coming. I'm clearly not trying to think them. You know, I'm clearly not in charge of them. You know, so that can be liberating." For some people, that's not liberating, it's terrifying. Right?
Well, why? Why is that liberating for me and terrifying for somebody else?
We ought to go get my partner from the other room who's reading a book on trauma-informed mindfulness. She might be able to better answer this question. But I do think some of it is, you know, what is your underlying state of mind. I'll give you an example. So I don't know if you're familiar with Johann Hari. He's written a couple books, but his most recent book is I think it's called Stolen Attention. It's about how we can't focus, and he talks about the societal and big scale reasons why we can't. But he references something that I've come across over and over and over again, and he talks about the default mode network. And so if you read enough of these books, you'll start to hear about the default mode network. I mean, it's like neuroplasticity. You can't read a damn book on self-help these days, or psychology or spirituality, without neuroplasticity. Like, we ought to create a bingo game out of these things, right? Neuroplasticity would be the number one hit. But default mode network is up there. And so depending on the book you're reading, you're going to read one of two things. If it's a meditation book on mindfulness, it's going to probably say, hey, meditation mindfulness calms down the default mode network. This is a good thing. You know, default mode network is where we obsess over self and we ruminate and we want to turn it down. If you're reading a book on creativity, you're almost certainly going to have somebody say, mind wandering is good. Mind wandering is what the default mode network does. You want to allow the default mode network to run wild. And you go, all right, well, do I want it? Do I not want it? Right? Johann Hari, in his classic way, the guy is really good, said, he just put it all together. He said, you know, if you're in a psychologically good place, the default mode network is your friend. You can let your mind kind of wander around, and it's going to make creative possibilities, and it's going to find good things, and great, let it go. If, on the other hand, you are not in such a good place, it can really be a bad place to be. And so I think there's something similar happening with mindfulness. And I can't say why some people find it more calming and insightful, and some people find it more frustrating and troubling. I do know that there are ways to approach meditation that make it more likely we'll have the experience you're describing versus the other. You know, there's certainly things we can do to approach our meditation practice in a different way. And there are lots of different ways to meditate. And so sometimes we have to try different methods till we find something that works for us. But some people, you know, I've got a friend right now. He's been having a very difficult time. A lot of anxiety. I think the pandemic really just freaked him out badly. He's had a lot of strain and struggle. It's been a rough few years for him. We're looking at like, okay, well, where can he go get a reset? When I want to go get a reset, I go do a silent week-long meditation retreat. I think sending him on a silent week-long meditation retreat would be a disaster. The last thing that guy needs is more time stuck in his own head.
Yeah.
It's just not the time for it for him. Right? So there may be another time in life where that is more what would make sense for him. So I think, that's my sort of meandering, incomplete answer.
I appreciate that. Well, one of the ways or times when meditation or maybe a retreat has served you is when you felt a sense of interconnectedness. And I think it was an Omega retreat with Adyashanti where you said you felt a feeling of ecstasy and oneness that you had previously never experienced. Could you break that down for me in layman's terms? Like, what does that mean exactly? How did that experience transform your rest of your life after having it?
Well, let me try and avoid terms that people who haven't read a bunch of mystic writing would understand. And I don't mean that like lots of people just simply haven't read that kind of stuff. I tend to default to those terms because I'm often talking to those kind of people. Yeah. The only way I can say it is it was a moment in which I had the very felt experience that I was not separate from the things that were around me. So, and one of the things about what we would call a mystical experience, which this is that they're very difficult to describe in words. So anybody who's listening to your show who's taken psychedelics at high enough doses has probably had an experience that was profound in some way that when they turn around to tell it to somebody, it sounds idiotic. You're like, dude, you were just high, right? But not necessarily, right? Those experiences can be profound, but we can't put them into words. So that's the mystical experiences are always that way. But I felt very clearly that I was not separate from the things around me. Now, I don't mean that I thought I was the tree over there. I knew I was not the tree. And yet, in the same moment, I also didn't feel separate from the tree. The best way the analogy I could think to make is, if you think about like a cell in your body, from one perspective, assume that cell could take on consciousness. It could go, I am a single cell out here taking on the world, and I got to hang as a single cell. And we would look at that and go, that's a perfectly valid perspective. You're right. But if we hop up one level, we might go, oh, well, actually, that cell is part of this organ. So it's actually, it's deeply connected with everything else. And from the perspective of the organ, that one cell isn't that big a deal, right? It's like, okay, it's a cell. It's important. It's got to be there. But, okay. We go up to the human level and we're like, well, a kidney, it's important. I don't want to lose it. But I could, And so depending on the viewpoint at which you take things, right? If you were to suddenly assume like a God's eye view and you were to look at all of human history, you would look at me and go, well, yeah, okay. Like Eric's part of it. Yep. But he's not the center of the universe like he thinks he is. Right? It was as if I had assumed that view in a way. Now, I don't mean it was like I was up above things looking down on them. I just simply saw that the tree and I felt equally important and connected. Everything around me. And the biggest thing that happened was the weight of identity, of feeling like Eric Zimmer had to present himself a certain way to the world, just vanished.
Wow.
And I no longer, and so it was just this deep, deep sense of freedom. That's the only way I can describe it. I felt like, years and years of stress were just like vanished. And I felt, I think the other thing that happened is I looked at everything in my life that was difficult because I was like, what is, like, how real is what's happening, and I would look at things in my life and I'd be like, that were difficult. And I'm like, well, no big deal.
Huh.
Like, you know, so.
Like what?
Well, at the time I was hoping, I did the podcast for 4.5 years while I held a full-time job. And around that time I was getting to the point where I was like, I think in the next year or two, I might be able to jump and do the podcast and the coaching full-time, which I really, really wanted, right? It's hard to hold a full-time job and, maybe you're doing it. Maybe you're familiar. I don't know. I don't know your backstory, but that was mine. And so that was really, really important to me. And in that moment, I just went, I guess if I just have to keep working this job the rest of my life, like it just didn't feel like a big deal. It just felt like, yeah, okay, doable, fine. But beyond that, and again, so words aren't really doing it justice, but it was just a deep sense of interconnection and lack of separation from everything else. Everything just felt like it was okay. 100% deeply, deeply okay.
And how did that inform the rest of what happened thereafter? How were you able to use that experience, if at all, and be able to come back to that experience if needed?
Yeah, that's a great question. What's typical of people who have experiences like that is that we just want more of them, and I'm wired up that way, right? Like I'm a drug addict, I followed feeling good to the edge of the line. So there's some of that naturally there. Luckily, the gentleman you referenced who I was on retreat with, Adi Ashanti, is somebody that we've got to interview several times, and I've gotten to know him a little bit, and I was able to sort of, turn to him for some counsel. And so it became very clear that chasing that experience wasn't going to work. But a couple things happened. I mean, the extreme feeling of that experience faded. But there were some things that have remained very much the same. I think my sense of personal identity has never come back to the same way. Like I just don't care as much what anybody thinks, and I don't feel a need to present myself in any certain way. And I was somebody who was very focused on that. I was very conscious of that stuff. So I'm not saying it's gone, but it's dramatically and I'm hoping permanently reduced, which is a great weight off my shoulders, right? I mean, it's a great weight off my shoulders to not walk into a room and be like, is everybody looking at me? What do they think of me? What are they, just not have that so much. I think more profoundly, what Adi Shanti said to me was devote yourself to whatever remains of that experience. And so for me, that's been really powerful because I've gone, okay, do I think that the view I saw of the world in those days was real? And I do actually think it was real. I don't think it's more real than necessarily normal consciousness, but I don't think it was, I do think it was real. I think it was another way of viewing reality. And so from that way of viewing reality, a way of reality that says there's deep interconnection between all things, how would somebody who believes that to be true act? Yeah. Even if they don't feel it in the moment, how would they act? And that's always been a pretty important part of my personal philosophy is, I try not to let my moods or my current experience drive my actions. I try and let my actions come from some more thoughtful idea of what I think is important in life, And so for me, that's been part of it is, okay, how does somebody act who believes that there's this interconnection, and how do they respond to difficulties? And so I think that's how it has influenced me, but it was an amazing experience, but it also, I left there not knowing if I was going to continue to do the podcast. I was in talks with a publisher to write a book, and I came out of there, I was like, I don't want to do it because I had been doing it because I wanted to be seen as an author, and that just, I no longer cared. And so it wasn't without its challenges, and I sometimes still think that it reduced my ambition in a way. That is, I don't know, is neither good nor bad, but has implications. I don't have the ambition of feeling like I have to prove myself, and that gave me a fair amount of energy. There's a fair amount of energy that can come out of that. That's gone, and so now I'm running off a different kind of fuel.
Yeah, one conversation I had with a recent guest was about where you receive energy from. For some people, it is about looking at the people who criticize them, who write bad things about them, and trying to prove those people wrong. Another group of people view it, try to harness the love that they have for who they're trying to help. And I think both can get you to your desired outcome. But the question I always have is, what is going to get you to your desired outcome with more joy? And go for it. Does anything ring up?
Yeah, totally. I have a program called Spiritual Habits that I lead, and the second lesson is about self-compassion. We talked about this a little bit earlier. And, one of the things that I talk about in there is that many of us, when I say, being nice to ourselves, being kinder to ourselves, works better than being really self-critical and really hard on ourselves. Inevitably, there are people who go, no, not me. Right? No, I work better by just kicking my ass, And I want to be clear, self-compassion is not about just not being accountable. But what I've found is that I do think that fuel of, I don't like myself and I'm going to prove everybody wrong, or I'm going to prove my dad wrong or my mom wrong. That fuel is a type of fuel that drives us, but I think it's kind of a dirty fuel.
Yeah.
And I think that over the years, it eventually clogs the engine. So what I see is a lot of people my age who that really worked for them for a while. And now it just doesn't. They're burnt out, and it seems that the path for them, the next transformation is to go from nearly hating themselves into achievement into, a different way of engaging with the world.
There's a price to pay for using that type of fuel.
Yeah.
Is what I'm hearing from what you're talking about. I
think so. Yeah. And I think there are lots of, I think there's a million shades of gray in between, right? I don't want to set myself up and paint myself as this angelic person who doesn't have any ego. I do this work, and there's always multiple motivations going on, right? One is I deeply want to help people. I love doing it. I love these kind of conversations. I love coaching people and seeing them change. I love the Spiritual Habits program. So there's a love that drives it. And it's how I make a living, and everybody wants to make a living, right? We want to do well. And, there is way less than there used to be, but there is an element of being seen in it. And so for me, I'm always trying to notice the different motivations and realign to the ones that feel cleaner, better, more aligned with my values. So, trying to do the podcast because I know it really helps people and I love doing it. That's a better motivation for me at this stage in my life than I'm going to catch that damn Tim Ferriss, right? It's just a different thing. It's a different thing. 20 years ago, I might have had that, nobody's going to beat me,
Yeah.
I just don't have as much of that anymore. And some of that is, I think, spiritual development and a variety of things. And I often wonder how much of it is also, we change as we age. And I think as we get older, we have the opportunity to become wiser. Now, obviously, not everybody who gets older becomes wiser. We see lots of people that aren't. But a lot of years does give you more and more opportunity to do it. So, I've just had a lot more opportunity to become wise than, say, you have, just by sheer number of days to practice it,
Absolutely.
Doesn't mean I'm wiser than you. But you get my point.
Yeah, absolutely. How do you think you were brought into this life with a specific purpose?
No, I don't really. That doesn't align with my my belief system. Now, again, I will caveat that to say, like, I don't really know. Who knows? Why
Totally.
we're here. That said, I do think that based on the way I was, my genetic makeup and my talents and the things that happened to me and the influences that I had and the experiences I had and the books I read and the people I talked to, that I was shaped in a certain way. And I do believe that there are certain types of work that are much more aligned with that shape. So you could say, in a way, the shape of me fits better in certain ways or other. But I don't think I was brought into the world with the purpose to do this. That's just not that's not the way I orient.
And the way you orient, what do you think happens after we die?
I have no idea. I really don't. And I don't spend much time thinking about it, honestly. Apparently the Buddha didn't either, depending on different, interpretations. It's one of the things he often said, like, you'll break your brain. This is not a direct quote. You'll break your brain. I think he called them the unknowables. Like, you're not going to know,
Yeah.
What I do know is that those experiences that I've had, like that one that I had, and I've had many others that are in that vein, maybe not quite as extreme. That one sort of stands out. Those experiences have sort of given me a sense of, I don't know, a sense of peace that, like, whatever happens afterwards just isn't that important. It's not. If I had to say, I would, if I had to make a bet, I would bet that I die. And, that the form of consciousness that has taken form as Eric is gone, but consciousness is not gone, and humans are not gone. And parts of me live on in people in ways, for sure, like my son and all the people. And so there's some part of me that carries on in that way. But for all I know, I could be sitting at the right hand of God here, and looking down on Danny and going, like, I hope he does well, so who knows?
Yeah. What in particular do you think drew you to Buddhism or your Zen practice in particular?
It made the most sense to me. Right out of the gate, if you look at Buddhism, the very first thing is the first noble truth. Life contains a lot of suffering. And I went, finally, somebody's telling the truth. Like, okay, now that I can believe in, right? That matches my experience of the world. So right out of the gate, I can sort of, and then the second noble truth says, like, and part of the reason that we suffer is because we always want something to be different than the way it is. And I went, that makes perfect sense to me too. Like, so there were just a lot of things about it that really I went, that seems to make sense to me. Whereas when I looked at, say, certain forms of Christianity, I went, that doesn't make sense to me personally. Now, I have some friends who are Christians, and my view of the world makes no sense to them. And they live beautiful and wonderful lives. And so I don't think that my view is better. My view works for me. So, but Buddhism just made sense to me. And I also loved, one of the things that the Buddha talked about was, don't take what I'm saying on faith. Take what I'm saying and go try it in your life. And if it works, you'll know it to be true. And I loved that too, because anybody who's convinced they know the truth, I instantly want to tell them why they're wrong. Even if I agree with them. Like, if you started arguing for why Buddhism is unequivocally right, I would start arguing with you probably, because I'd be like, you don't know that, Danny. So there was a natural skepticism built right into the heart of Buddhism, I felt like, that really spoke to me, at least the type of Buddhism that was presented to me as a Westerner. Now, when we say Buddhism, it's sort of like, it means so many different things depending on the tradition, the culture, all that. There's a particular westernized version of it that we've been presented that made sense to me, and maybe that's because I'm a Westerner, right? So, but
Yeah. When I just take your experience in for the last hour and in doing research for this, I get such a deep sense of thoughtfulness of what you say and how you approach the world. Like, the number one thing that sticks out to me is thoughtfulness. Do you agree with that assessment? And if you do, what do you think has led to that thoughtfulness to occur?
I would tend to agree. I try and be thoughtful, or actually, I don't even try that hard. It seems to be sort of a naturally evolving quality. What has led to that? The flip answer would be, when you've been as wrong as I have so many times in life, you actually start to go, well, hold on a second, let me think before I talk. I think there's an element of that in it. I think I have a tendency to, for whatever reason, I try and think about what I'm being told and think about how does it apply. And I think the other thing I think is, you work in the addiction world and you work in, I've had depression. I know a lot of people who've had depression. After a while, you start to realize that easy answers don't work. That like, someone will be like, well, if you just, eat a probiotic diet, your depression will go away. And you're like, well, maybe, but there's a ton of people that doesn't, so you start to see that, like, there's a whole lot of complexity here. And so that's what I see when I look at the world, is I see, like, things are complex. There are not easy answers. And so starting from that point then causes thoughtfulness, I think, because you go, okay, wait, all right, that sounds really good, and I wish it was that simple. I really do. I mean, I would love some simple answers. And I don't mean that everything has to be unnecessarily complex. But I think it's a natural attribute that comes from really looking at the world and really trying to make change in the world. I think if you really are working to make change in the world, not just talking about change, but actually in the trenches trying to make change, you start to go, geez, that sounds really good when you read it in a book, or when somebody gets on stage and speaks it, or you hear it in a podcast. It all sounds good and easy. But now I'm trying it and I go, wait, what do I, okay, so I'm supposed to allow my thoughts to come. But what do I do with the thought that tells me that, I hate my mom? Do I let that one come? Do I let that one go? You start to realize, like, there's real complexity in this stuff. And so I think that's what causes, for me, thoughtfulness.
How has interacting with so many of the people you've studied in books and on stages, and you're now talking to them face to face or over the phone for an hour at a time, how has that changed your perception of the people themselves and the material that you're reading or listening to?
I certainly think that I have a different perspective on people that many of us might look up to and go, oh, wow, that's an incredible person, right? Yeah. And I think I have a much better sense of, like, their work might be incredible. They may have a mind that was able to articulate something in a really incredible way, but that doesn't necessarily mean that their life is easy. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're nice to the people around them. It doesn't necessarily mean. So I think those people they feel a lot more like they're not a separate. There's not a lot of hero worship left. Let's put it that way, right? Like, I had Jack Kornfield on the show recently. Jack Kornfield has been a guy who's influenced me since 1994, probably, right? So what is that? I don't know how many years that is. That's a lot of years. I probably have more Jack Kornfield in my ears than maybe any other human being, right? 5 years ago, maybe 5 years ago, but certainly 9 years ago, before I started the podcast, if you'd let me get in front of Jack Kornfield, I probably would have been somewhat starstruck. it didn't have that feeling. Now, I had a deep sense of reverence for the man, right? I have a deep love and gratitude for the man, but I don't look at him as like some separate creature. You know, I look at him and I go, and Jack, don't take anything personal here, but like, oh yeah, well, he had a divorce not that long ago. So he's not the Buddha. Would the Buddha have gotten divorced? Maybe. You know, Adyashanti said to me once, if you want a perfect spiritual teacher, find a dead one, right? Like, I think the other thing that really that has happened with those people, and I think this is actually a very instructive and important lesson for all of us, is that, let's say I'm talking to somebody and they've written 5 New York Times bestsellers, and we're all like, oh my God, it's, you know, Seth Godin. That doesn't matter. Pick your person. That person, when they sit down to write their next book, they are struggling. They doubt that they can do it. It's hard to do. They write stuff that they think is crap. We seem to think that for these people it's easy, or once you do it, it's always easy, but it's still really hard. And I think that's really important to know, because we have a tendency to go, oh, it feels really hard, so I must not be able to do it. And the lesson I've gotten from all these people is like, I started my next book and I really, honestly, Eric, there were points I thought I couldn't do it. I thought I'm done, you know, and we can look at them and be like, but you wrote 4 before. Like, of course you can do it. But in their mind, they're like, well, you wrote 4 before, but the game's up. And I've seen the same thing in myself. Like, you know, if I'm giving a public talk or I'm creating a new piece of curriculum for students or whatever, in the middle of it, I'm like, I can't do it. I've done it before, but I got nothing. And now there is something to be said for talking to ourselves and going, okay, you have done it before, Eric. Relax, take a deep breath. Like, you know, for me, what's helpful is I know, like, it always feels this way. And so that's what's helpful from people like that. But I would say the biggest thing has been realizing that they're normal people. They might have great minds. They might have great ability to articulate things. That doesn't necessarily mean that all that insight is operable in their lives all the time. And they struggle just like we do. They have good days and bad days, just like all of us.
Yeah. On that topic of masters, and speaking of people who have mastered things, what do you feel like you've mastered, and what do you feel like you're still learning?
I don't feel like I've mastered anything. I mean, I really don't feel like I'm a master of anything. So I feel, I think I'm still learning, I'm capable of still learning in any area I'm working in. That doesn't mean I am actively learning in all those areas, but I'm certainly, there is more to learn, and for whatever reason, and maybe that is some degree of wisdom, is you realize, like, no matter how much you learn, there tends to be more to learn. It's like playing guitar. Like, I play guitar and I'm an okay guitar player, but like, I could continue to improve at a rapid rate every day the rest of my life, and there would still be room to grow there. And I think everything is that way. Everything has, maybe not tic-tac-toe, right? But anything of value has kind of immeasurable depth to it, which is kind of a beautiful thing.
Yeah. I don't know. From my perspective, I consider you a master at podcasting. The way you ask questions, the thoughtfulness that you take to conversations. But I could understand from your perspective, you being, well, I've only been doing it for X years. I could be doing it for 10 more years and I'd still have things to learn about.
Yeah, it's less, that's an art that, when you get into something that I would say at a certain point becomes an art, right? There is no end of your ability to interact with it in different ways, So do I, the question that's most alive for me these days with this stuff is, we're coming up on episode number 500.
Congratulations.
How does it remain fresh and alive? How do you approach something when you've read the same thing in 55 other books? Where, what do you do when there's not a lot of novelty there? What, and so I don't know the answer to those questions, right? And I'm not saying that this is, that it's become stale to me, but I'd be lying if I didn't say there are some days it feels stale. 500 episodes, 8 years is a long time. There are times I'm like, I'm going to go do a show on real estate. Like, give me something brand new, right? And yet, so I think that's an example of, how do I connect with the material on a deeper and different level? How do I, so I think there's always learning and changing and, Van Gogh clearly, if you'd asked him, would say he was no master at painting. He hadn't mastered it. I doubt Beethoven or Mozart would think they had mastered the symphony, right? Now, please, I'm not trying to compare myself to Van Gogh, Mozart, and Beethoven. What I'm trying to say is, even if you take people who are way out there with their greatness, you would look at that. If you ask them, they'd go, "Yeah, still learning, still, or at least still." Like, there's this little area over here that I'm, trying to figure out.
I love it. A constant, lifelong approach to learning, I think, is a beautiful place to come to a close. Where can we send people to connect with you further, Eric?
Yeah, oneyoufeed.net. That's ONEYOUFEED.net. And probably the best thing to do is just go there and get on the mailing list. We've got a meditation guide, and from there you get updates on all the episodes and all the programs and all kinds of stuff. So that's probably the best bet. Amazing.
Well, from having this conversation, I feel a real sense of peace and calmness, and I'm just grateful for you for spending the time with me here today. So thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Danny. I really appreciated this, and you may feel like you're early at it, but you've got some skills for sure.
Thank you.
That was well done.
Thank you. I appreciate that.